This story's pretty detailed, so I'm gonna get right into it. Only relevant details, though. I'm 22 years old, freshly graduated from college. Since I was maybe 3 or 4, my family's lived in a 3-story home in a relatively nice area. If you're picturing the quintessential suburban neighborhood, you've got the right idea. As for the layout of the house, this is all you need to know. My bedroom, which is on the 2nd floor, has a window that faces the street, and the only window in my dad's home office, which is on the 3rd floor, also faces the street. That's it. The reason I'm writing this is because after the events of last week, I'm now 100% convinced something sinister is happening to my family for some inexplicable reason I can't even begin to conceive of. And if I'm connecting the dots correctly, which I'm pretty sure I am, it's been going on for years. This first relevant thing happened so long ago that I don't even remember how old I was, but I was young enough to still be in middle school, so it had to have been at least 10 years ago. It was either a Saturday or a Sunday since I didn't have school, and as I was walking downstairs for breakfast, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. I didn't catch much of the conversation, but I was able to hear my dad talking about how something had happened again, and it must have been at least a little concerning judging by the tone he was using. My parents didn't tell me what was going on when I asked them about it. They actually didn't tell me directly for over a year afterwards, but I learned the real story a few days later from my older brother. My dad's a lawyer and often works into the night whenever he's pressured to finish something that doesn't get done at the office, and that's what he was doing until about 2 a.m. the night before I overheard him talking to my mom about the incident. According to my dad, he was working away at his desk at around midnight when he noticed a Chevy Suburban drive down the street at like 5 miles per hour. That's not an exaggeration. He claims to this day that the car looked like it was crawling down the street, as if someone had taken their foot off both the gas and the brake and was just letting the car idle forward. My dad didn't think much of it until he saw the exact same car drive back down the street, only this time in the opposite direction. And then, even more strangely, the car actually parked across the street, right in front of our house. My dad didn't take his eye off the car for a good few minutes straight, waiting to see whether someone would get out of the car or if it would drive off. But neither happened. The car just sat there. My dad didn't have the time or the patience to devote the rest of the night to watching the car, so he went back to work, glancing out the window every so often out of curiosity. But nothing happened for hours. He swore no one ever got out of the car, since he would have noticed movement out the window if they had. Eventually, he fell asleep at his desk around 2 a.m. without even completing his work. But here's the crazy part. When he woke up around 5:30, the car was still there in the exact same spot. What happened while he was asleep remains a mystery, but my dad said he was so shocked to see the car still there when he woke up, he thought he was dreaming. The car ended up leaving before sunrise, and even after finishing his work, my dad was so unsettled he couldn't sleep. I would eventually learn that this wasn't the first instance of something similar happening, that my dad had seen cars drive back and forth on our street late at night before, but it was definitely the strangest. No one in the family really thought anything of it for several years though. It was most likely just someone sleeping in a very coincidental spot, and at the very worst, it was someone driving around random nice neighborhoods and casing houses. Fast forward a few years, I'm 15 now, a sophomore in high school. I remember the second occurrence much more distinctly, partly because it was more recent and partly because it actually happened to me. I was up late making beats in my room, something I did quite often during that time in my life. Like I said earlier, my room has a window that faces the street, which I can always see out of since my desk is right in front of it. I was vibing out with my headphones in, when something from outside my bedroom window caught my eye. It was a little flicker of light, definitely unnatural and definitely not my imagination. I diverted my attention to the window and saw the strangest, most unsettling thing. There was a squadron of cars, at least 3 of them. They were driving down the street at a slow speed. That by itself doesn't sound so bad, but I quickly realized that the people in the cars were shining flashlights at houses. That's what the flicker of light had been. I kept watching in this state of confused angst as whoever was in the first car swept their flashlight beam across the house next to mine. Then they started shining their light at my house, and I actually ducked down underneath my windowsill when I realized the beam was about to sweep right past my window. Not 2 seconds after ducking down, I watched the flashlight beam illuminate my ceiling for a couple seconds before everything went dark again. I waited a good 20 seconds before re-emerging, and by the time I did, the cars were much further down the street. I watched as they got to the end of the street and turned off. You can probably imagine how I was feeling in that moment. It was tough to get much sleep after that. I obviously told my parents about it the next morning, and as a family, we collectively agreed that it was a group of thugs casing houses, probably looking for ones with no one home that would make easy targets for a home intrusion. My dad installed a Ring camera after that, and he even put some security cameras with motion lights in our backyard. I can't remember for sure, but I think my parents might have talked to a few of our neighbors to see if anyone had experienced something similar. A couple years later, the next thing happened. While doing some landscaping in our backyard, one of the contractors my dad had hired claimed to have found a small hidden camera tucked into one of the bushes near the fence. It was tiny, no bigger than a car key, but it was definitely a camera. It was battery powered, and the battery had long since died. It didn't have a SIM card or any memory card inside, which meant it wasn't storing anything locally or using cellular data. But that didn't rule out the possibility that it had been streaming footage to an external device nearby while it was active. My dad said the most likely explanation was that someone had been parked close enough to receive a live feed until the battery gave out. Why anyone would go through the trouble of hiding something like that on our property and then just leave it behind was a complete mystery to us, but it definitely wasn't the kind of thing that you stumble across by accident. As furious as my dad was, he couldn't figure out when or who had placed it there, even after combing through the last few months of security camera footage, or at least everything the thing had recorded and stored. I was convinced that one of my friends had been pranking us, but even after pestering all of them, no one fessed up to placing that camera there. My parents were really worried we were being targeted, and they even reported everything to the police, but the home security they had already installed was pretty top-notch, so it wasn't like they could upgrade things much. Nothing happened for a little while after that. It wasn't like there was this cloud hanging over our heads. We all just kind of moved on with our lives the way most people probably would. The next thing worth mentioning happened a few years after we discovered the camera. Our immediate next-door neighbors moved away, and their house was re-inhabited super quickly, like it was only vacant for a few weeks at most. That's not exactly the most unusual thing. My neighborhood has always been a very desirable place for families to live. However, I noticed pretty quickly that the people who moved in weren't parents, just a youngish couple with no children. I remember finding that odd considering the size of the house, but I assumed maybe they were planning on starting a family, or maybe they just wanted a big place all to themselves. On several occasions after they moved in, though, I caught them looking into our yard through their top floor window, always at strange hours, either really early in the morning or really late at night. At first, I figured they had a workstation or office up there like my dad, and they were just seated right in front of the window, but then I noticed they were always standing, which eliminated the desk hypothesis. I knew I was just being paranoid, but I'm a pretty observant person by nature, so if someone's gonna do something out of the ordinary, I'm gonna notice it. Either way, I didn't think much of it, just found it mildly amusing that our neighbors seemed fascinated with the layout of our yard or whatever else it was that they were always looking at. One night, while walking my dog on the street, I couldn't help but notice my neighbors in their kitchen through their big bay window. They were sitting at a table, and for the first time since they had moved in, there was a third person with them. The guy had really distinctive features. He was fully bald, really muscular, and had the thickest eyebrows I'd ever seen. The three of them, he and the couple, were just sitting and talking at the table, nothing unusual. But as if they noticed me looking, the woman swiftly walked over to the window and pulled the curtains over it. She didn't actually look out the window at me. None of them did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she shut the curtains because somehow she knew I was watching. Either way, I didn't forget about the man that had been with them. His face was just so distinctive. I don't really know what else to say. Okay, so now that you've made it this far, you're probably thinking that I'm some paranoid schizophrenic. I mean, that's what I'd be thinking too. But I would never in a million years be sending the story in if what happened next didn't happen. Like I said in the beginning, this happened last week, so about another few years after the last thing I talked about. A few weeks ago, my family took a trip to Paris. My older brother had been dating his girlfriend for years, and everyone was pretty much expecting him to propose while we were there because we were going with her family too. A few days into the trip, we were at this random bar. Everyone was there, me, my parents, my brothers, his girlfriend, and her parents. We were sitting in a booth, enjoying a few drinks and having some good conversation. I was maybe halfway through my drink, zoning out of the conversation, when I happened to glance across the room. There was this guy sitting alone in a booth, just casually sipping his drink and looking around the room. Something about him seemed familiar, but I couldn't immediately place where I'd seen him before. But then, like a light switch had been turned on, I realized it was that man who I'd seen at my neighbor's kitchen table years ago. There was no way. I didn't want to believe it. What were the chances this random guy from my neighborhood would be in the exact same bar as my family in a foreign country, no less? I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but the more I stared, the more certain I became that it was him. Then he caught me looking at him. We locked eyes for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. He knew, I knew, and he knew I knew. I could feel it. Then, without finishing his drink or paying his bill, he got up and walked out of sight. I immediately excused myself from the table and tried to follow him, but I couldn't figure out where he had gone. I ended up just sitting back down at the table, trying to suppress the nasty feeling I had. Telling myself that the guy just happened to be on vacation the same time we were was the only way I could continue my night with my sanity. A few days later, we were doing some typical touristy stuff. It was broad daylight, and we were just walking around the city when I saw him again. That same guy. I can't understate how shocking it was. If the first instance had just been a coincidence, this completely shattered that theory. He was standing maybe 50 feet from us, snapping pictures with a professional-looking camera. I couldn't tell for sure, but it kinda seemed like the camera was pointed in our direction, even though there was a famous monument behind us. I watched as he then turned a corner and disappeared out of sight. I finally told my parents about what was going on. I gave them every little detail and assured them I wasn't going crazy. My parents actually believed me, my dad especially, and he even suggested cutting the trip short. We didn't end up doing that, but the rest of the vacation was awful. When we finally got home, my dad checked as much security footage as was stored, but didn't find anything. I really don't know what to make of all of this. I don't know what these people want from us, or who they even are, but now I'm convinced they've been watching us for over a decade, which sounds insane, and I only have reason to believe things are going to escalate from here. My parents' house never really felt like a parent's house. Not in the normal way, at least. My dad traveled for work constantly, and my mom was always out with friends or staying over my aunt's house, or doing something else where she'd come home late or not at all. I know that sounds kinda messed up, but it was just the reality. It wasn't like they abandoned me or anything. It was more like they were always busy and always somewhere else. So from the time I was like 16 and up, I basically lived alone. I ate dinner alone most nights, I watched TV alone, I'd be the only person in the house for an entire weekend sometimes. I'm an only child, and I think that's because my parents realized after having me how much they valued their own freedom. So in that regard, I did suffer, which is something I feel more now as an adult. When I was younger, I used to love it because it felt like freedom having such a big place to myself. I could do whatever I wanted without my parents breathing down my neck, and I didn't have to share it with siblings. I could bring friends over and play games late. I could talk to girls on the phone without being embarrassed. It felt like having my own home without paying for it. And even when I turned 19 and started going to a nearby college, nothing changed. If anything, it got even more like that. My mom and dad were gone or out more, and I was basically just holding it down at home. I knew every noise that house made too. That part matters because it wasn't one of those houses where every creak freaked you out. It was an older but larger house, and it had its usual sounds. I always just said the damn place had character. So this happened on a night where I knew for a fact I was going to be alone. My dad was out of town for work, and my mom had been talking all week about how she was staying at my aunt's because they were having some big family thing the next day, and she didn't want to drive back late. I remember her telling me, "It's just you tonight," and I honestly didn't even care. That was normal. I told her that she didn't even have to tell me that. I made food, I watched TV, I did the usual. At around 11, I went upstairs to my room and started watching YouTube videos in bed, something I do some nights for hours. My room was at the end of the hallway upstairs. At the top of the stairs, you'd have a small landing, and then to the right was my parents' room, and further down the hallway was the bathroom, the linen closet, and then my room at the end. I had my door open because my parents told me to keep doors open at night, more as a staying alert and listening for intruders type of thing. But I also liked hearing the house a little, like background noise. It made the whole being alone thing feel less intense. I eventually started getting tired, so I shut my laptop and just laid there scrolling on my phone. So I'm gonna just say that probably an hour passed from the moment I shut my laptop to when my phone rang. It said no caller ID on the screen. That was the first time I'd ever received a no caller ID phone call. I stared at it for a second. To be receiving that late at night was sketchy as hell. I ignored it, but it rang again right after, still saying no caller ID. That's what made me answer. I figured if it was someone important, they would call twice. Plus, it's just a phone call. Worst case scenario, I hang up. So I picked up, and at first, there was no noise. I got nervous that it was one of those scam calls that calls to see if a number is active to add it to some call center database. But then I started hearing something faint, and it took my brain a second to process what it even was. It sounded like a TV playing in the background, and what was weird was that I could also faintly hear my own TV downstairs through the door, because earlier I guess I left it on in the living room. I didn't have it on loud, just on low volume as background noise, so hearing TV audio on the phone instantly made my stomach tighten. I said hello a second time, to once again no response. Just the TV sound, like whoever was on the other end wasn't even trying to speak. It was just there. Then I realized something that made me sit up in bed instantly. The TV noise I was hearing through the phone wasn't random. It matched my TV downstairs, like perfectly. It wasn't delayed, it was the exact same audio at the exact same moments, like it was synced. That's when I got this cold feeling down my spine, because there's only one way that makes sense. That would mean whoever was on the phone could hear my TV in real time, as in, they were inside my house downstairs. I tried to force a normal explanation, like it was a friend standing outside one of my windows downstairs trying to trick me, or maybe the call was somehow glitching and picking up on my microphone audio. That can happen, but the more I listened, the more I realized that didn't make sense. It sounded like someone was calling me while standing somewhere in my living room. I got up and walked to my bedroom door and listened. And oh yeah, I was 1,000,000% sure now that the audio on the phone was syncing to the TV. In hindsight, this was dumb, but I screamed out, "Who's down there?" because in the back of my mind, I thought for sure I knew it was a friend or family member pulling something. And then, the line went dead. They hung up. By this point, my mouth went completely dry. I couldn't even call the number back because it was an anonymous call. I walked out into the hallway towards the stairs, and I looked down. I still heard the TV on in the living room, and then a creak. It sounded like the wood floor cracking from the pressure of a person, but if that didn't confirm things, the moment I heard someone clearing their throat downstairs, that's when everything instantly became 10 times more real. I could no longer lean on the glitching phone theory, even though deep down I already knew that was BS anyway. I went to my room and quietly closed and locked the door. What if my dad was testing me, seeing how I'd react in a home intrusion situation, or maybe my Uncle T? So I called my dad, but he didn't pick up. He may have already been asleep. It was like 11:30, so I called again and again, but no luck. I tried my luck with Uncle T, and he picked up on the second ring. I could tell he was in bed. He asked why I was calling, and I prefaced the phone call telling him this might sound crazy, and then dropped the bomb and asked if he was downstairs. I remember vividly his exact response and tone as he said, "Steve, what the hell are you talking about?" When I elaborated, he told me that's definitely something his brother would do, his brother aka my dad. While we were on the phone, my phone started vibrating. I looked at the screen, and it was the no caller ID on the screen again. I begged my Uncle T to stay on the line real quick. I was putting him on hold as I picked up. He said okay. so I picked up the other call. As I said hello, there was the same silence. This time, I didn't hear the TV sounds on the other end. What did that mean? It seemed they had the phone on speaker because I could hear their footsteps. They were moving, and the footsteps were matching the footsteps I suddenly started hearing outside of my bedroom. I prayed with all my heart this was my dad messing with me. Then, my doorknob jiggled, and whoever was on the other side tried pushing the door. Thank God it was an old, heavy door with an old, heavy lock. The sound still synced with what I was hearing on the phone. Whoever was on the other side of the door knocked. I had the sudden thought to merge the two calls, and when I did, I yelled into the phone for my Uncle T, saying, "It's not my dad, get here now." I also yelled that whoever was in the house was also on the phone with us. My uncle seemed to wake up from this, and he started yelling into the phone things like, "I'm coming, you cocksucker." The no-caller ID caller hung up the phone, and I heard footsteps move away from the door. This all but confirmed it was in fact not my dad. My uncle told me to stay in the bedroom. He was on his way. I wasn't a little kid, but I wasn't some big brolic man either. I was some skinny 19-year-old. My uncle knew I was in danger. He started heading over to the house. We lived in the same town at the time, but that 7 minutes he took to get to the house was the longest 5 years I'd ever experienced. I heard the familiar voice of my uncle screaming downstairs finally, so I rushed out of the room and downstairs. Having him there made everything feel better. We called the cops together while searching around the house for stolen items. The TV in the living room was still on. Before the cops got to the house, we found the kitchen window to be fully open enough for someone to crawl through. That info was of course relayed to the police, who, when they got there, did what I imagined to be a standard police search of the premises, asking us to lead them around the house, but from behind them. We cleared the whole house, and whoever was in there initially was no longer there. After the cops were done, they asked to see the no-caller ID calls in my recent calls. I showed them, and one of the officers told us that even though it says no caller ID, sometimes they can still request records and trace it from where it came. They said it could take a few days, but they'd get back to us. My uncle stayed over that night, which made me feel safer. We kept every light on like little kids. A few days later, one of the officers called me back surprisingly. The number was traced back to someone I actually knew. It was an old acquaintance from high school. Not a friend or enemy, but someone who had my number and address and such. I hadn't seen him in years. The cops asked if I wanted to come with them while they questioned him, so my uncle and I went since he was there on the scene with me originally. When the guy's dad answered the door and saw the police, he instantly called his son down without question, and I could see it in his son's face that he was nervous. The officer and I asked him straight up if he made those calls. He immediately said no. Then he said his phone had been stolen a few days ago. He claimed he lost it at a party and never got it back. The cop asked why he didn't report it stolen. He just shrugged it off and said he was going to get a new one anyway. The cop told him they'd follow up if needed, and that was basically it. His dad just stood there the whole time watching, but he weirdly didn't say anything. There was no big gotcha moment or arrest or anything. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The nervous look on his face when he came to the door. Was it a look of guilt, or a natural look anyone would have when being greeted with police on your front doorstep? If it really was a stolen phone, that means someone stole his phone specifically to call me and break into my parents' house. And that's without a doubt scarier than if it was him. It was a weekend like so many before. The usual crew was getting ready to meet up at Cody's house to pregame and go out. This was post-college. We were all 23 to 24 at the time. Cody's house was often the spot to pre- and post-game simply because he had a cool basement where his parents couldn't hear us, but also because his parents were chill. It was just the four of us going out to some local bars tonight: Cody, Randy, Jake, and I. When all four of us were there, we decided on who was calling the Uber, and once we did, we were out of there. Fast forward a few hours at a bunch of dive bars and then a dance bar, and eventually Cody and I decided to go home. We were tired. Randy and Jake were staying out later. Cody called the Uber back, I think, and he offered me the pull-out couch in the basement when we got to his place. He came downstairs with me to help me set it up, and while down there, we played a game of Madden. Honestly, I've always sucked at Madden, so he destroyed me and I didn't want to play again. I was tired and just wanted to sleep the alcohol off before I made the inevitable hangover even worse. Cody went upstairs and shut the door, and I was left alone in the darkness. The only thing that kept that basement from being complete and total blackness were the lights from the cable box clock under the TV, the actual standby light of the TV itself, and a slight green glow from a Heineken mini fridge on the other side of the basement. That mini fridge would also provide some weirdly relaxing white noise that would help me fall asleep. So things faded to black as I knocked out like a baby. A drunk baby. I woke up and it was still dark. I didn't know what time it was, but I knew it was still late at night, or super early, whatever you want to call 3 or 4 a.m. My mouth was so cotton-mouthed dry I could actually barely move my mouth. I stupidly didn't think to bring down a bottle or a glass of water before going to sleep. After drinking all that alcohol, it was no wonder I woke up. I just really didn't want to get up though. It's a very familiar and relatable conflicting feeling that anyone who's woken up hungover and thirsty has felt. I tried to ignore it at first. I rolled over to get a look at the Heineken fridge to see if anything was in there, but it was just alcohol. And then, for whatever reason, my eyes darted to the other corner of the room. I felt like my eyes were playing tricks on me at first, but I could swear I was looking at a black mass in the corner of the room. A black mass that I didn't remember seeing there ever before. I tried to wait for my eyes to adjust better to the dark, expecting the black mass to be some coat on a coat rack or something. But the longer I stared, the more I realized it was moving. It was a person. The amount of restraint I had to not scream was insane. I didn't think it was Cody just based on the sheer height of the mass alone. Without panicking, I had to figure out how to get out of there. After a tense couple of minutes, I sat up and fake yawned as if I was stretching, pretending I didn't notice that person in the corner. I then started fake talking to myself, like muttering complaints about not bringing water down here. Anything to give the appearance that I was oblivious and just going to get water, not run away and alert anyone. I got up and walked closer to the stairs, but also closer to the figure in the corner, and perhaps the most tense moment of my life was when I turned to the right to get to the stairs, and I hoped I wasn't grabbed. When I started going up the stairs, I didn't run or anything. I took it slow and normal to not draw suspicion. But when I was about halfway up, I took a curious glance down the stairs, and that black mass was now at the bottom of the stairs, and I can confirm it was a person. I almost tripped as I started to run up the rest of the stairs and slam the basement door shut. I then started running up the stairs to the upper level of the house to Cody's room, where I shook him awake and yelled at him that there's someone in the basement and that he needs to wake up his dad. And during that commotion, I heard a slam from downstairs, and I yelled, "See?" Cody got up, and we went to his parents' room where we woke up his dad, and I told him there's someone in the basement. He got right out of bed without asking questions and ran down both flights of stairs to the basement, noting that the basement door was wide open. And when I mentioned I shut the basement door, Cody's dad yelled at Cody to call the cops, and he did. We also noticed the back door to the house was now open. So when the three of us were done looking through the basement, we all went to the backyard to search. Then the front yard, and then the neighboring yards, all while Cody was still describing what was going on to the 911 operator. I'd say we were searching for 15 minutes before the police finally arrived, and then they did their full search, and formally wrote up a report for the incident. By the end of it, there were some neighbors waking up and coming outside asking if everything was okay. By that point, I was sobered up, terrified, and wanted to go home. So as soon as the cops left, I went inside to talk with them for a bit, then I said goodbye and called an Uber home, refusing Cody's offer to drive me home. I worried for them a bit that night, but I was not sleeping in that basement after that. In fact, I never did again. We'd still have pre-games and stuff there, but the feeling in that basement changed for a while after that night, where I'd always glance at that corner of the basement and just think back to that night. That black mass